Die erste Veranstaltung in Europa, aber wie? Und es folgen heuer noch 2 Veranstaltungen in dieser Reihe. Die erste wird im Juni stattfinden, Donnerstag, Freitag, 18. und 19. Juni, wo wir die deutsche Soziologin und Politikwissenschaftlerin Birgit Mahnkopf erwarten, Inhaberin des Lehrstuhls für europäische Gesellschaftspolitik in Berlin. Ja, auch das wird ein Abendvortrag sein und am nächsten Tag ein Workshop, sowie auch morgen Vormittag ein Workshop mit Chantal Mouffe stattfindet. Die dritte Veranstaltung in dieser Europa-Reihe im heurigen Jahr wird im November stattfinden. Und zwar erwarten wir da den britischen Politikwissenschaftler Colin Crouch, bekannt durch seine Thesen zur sogenannten Post-Democracy. Sie sehen also, es lohnt sich durchaus, das Newsletter der Grünen Akademie zu beziehen, und deshalb geht auch eine Liste durch. Wir belästigen Sie nicht viel hier mit diesem Newsletter. Normalerweise 2-mal im Monat kommt ein Newsletter heraus und da erfahren Sie über diese Veranstaltung. Was möchten wir mit dieser Reihe? Wir möchten eine kritische Annäherung an Europa starten, abseits der nationalistischen und populistischen antieuropäischen Haltungen einerseits, aber auch andererseits in Abgrenzung zu einer rein moralisierenden, pro-europäischen Werbelinie eigentlich, eine Propaganda, die tatsächliche Probleme und Interessenskonflikte übersieht oder überdeckt, kaschiert oder gar leugnet. Und Chantal Mouffe ist gerade dafür eine geeignete Diskussionspartnerin heute Abend. Sie sieht die Konfliktlinien, sie analysiert die Konfliktlinien, die Interessensgegensätze, die Antagonismen und macht politische Handlungsvorschläge für den Umgang mit pluralen Interessen. Und sie spricht sich für eine Repolitisierung aus. Sie kritisiert eine Politik, die sich das Heft aus der Hand nehmen hat lassen in den letzten Jahrzehnten, die im Sog eines hegemonialen Neoliberalismus eigentlich keine Politik mehr macht. Wir sind also sehr gespannt auf Ihre Analyse, wie wir in Europa die Demokratie zurückgewinnen können, wie es im Untertitel heißt. Und ich möchte jetzt zunächst einmal übergeben an den Florian Ungerböck, den ÖH-Vorsitzenden.
Genau, danke, Eva Fenster, für die Grüne Akademie. Mein Name ist Florian Ungerböck, ich bin heute aber nicht in meiner Funktion als Vorsitzender der ÖH da, sondern als Sprecher der GRAS, der Grünen und Alternativen Studenten und Studentinnen. Ich möchte mich mal bei der Grünen Akademie bedanken, einfach für diese Kooperation, auch bei den jungen Grünen, für die Bewerbung auch von heute, beziehungsweise bei Chantal Mouffe, dass sie heute da ist. Dankeschön. Die GRAS versucht eben in der ÖH-Uni Graz auch einen alternativen Weg zu gehen, sich auch dem neoliberalen Dogma, das ja auch in die Bildungspolitik eindringt, zu stellen und hier ein Gegenmodell voranzutreiben oder irgendwo überhaupt bemerkbar zu machen. Leider die ÖH kämpft teilweise gegen Windmühlen an. Es ist die Bildungspolitik ist eben gezeichnet von auch Bildung, die man sich leisten können muss. Es gibt schon viele Studiengänge mit Zugangsbeschränkungen, wofür man teure Vorbereitungskurse zum Beispiel besuchen muss, um dort überhaupt reinzukommen. Und wir als GRAS positionieren uns eben dagegen, dass wir einfach sagen, Bildung muss ein Menschenrecht sein. Bildung ist wichtig für eine Gesellschaft, um überhaupt reflektieren zu können, was die Gesellschaft so macht. Gerade eben, dass der Kapitalismus die Gesellschaft durchdringt, dass man eben ein Gegenmodell auch entwickeln kann. Ja, zum Thema Menschenrecht. Wir haben heute auch im Anschluss an die Veranstaltung um 21 Uhr eine Gedenkaktion geplant im Universitätsinnenhof. Wir wollen dort 10.000 Lichter anzünden für die leider Verstorbenen an der Außengrenze der EU. Das ist mir persönlich sehr am Herzen, weil jeden Tag Menschen an der Außengrenze der EU sterben. Es hat auch ökonomische Gründe, warum die EU eben sich abschottet. Ja, mir bleibt eigentlich nicht mehr viel, außer genau darauf hinzuweisen, dieser Vortrag wird eben aufgezeichnet, auch die Diskussion danach. Deswegen bitte ich, also wenn jetzt schon jemand nicht gefilmt werden möchte, bitte kurz der Kamerafrau das Bescheid zu geben, beziehungsweise dass sie einfach darauf Rücksicht nehmen kann und danach auch zu sagen, wenn eine Wortmeldung nicht aufgezeichnet werden soll. Das ihr bitte im Nachhinein Bescheid zu geben. Gut, dann darf ich übergeben an die Moderatorin. Ich wünsche einen schönen Abend.
Ja, danke auch von mir. Ich freue mich sehr, den heutigen Abend zu moderieren. Vielleicht noch ganz kurz zum Ablauf, bevor ich die Sprecherin, die ich eigentlich gar nicht mehr vorstellen muss, noch einleite. Der Vortrag wird auf Englisch stattfinden. Wer eine simultane Übersetzung möchte, die beiden sitzen hier und die Headsets können gerne in Anspruch genommen werden. Im Anschluss an die Diskussion, an die Abschlussdiskussion einfach in der Bank liegen lassen, die werden wieder eingesammelt. Und es wird anschließend an den Vortrag von der Chantal Mouffe einen kurzen Kommentar von der Sandra Krautwaschel, der Spitzenkandidatin der Grünen bei den Landtagswahlen geben und anschließend die Gelegenheit zu Fragen, zu Diskussionen, zur Debatte. Ja, ich freue mich, Ihnen heute die Vortragende des heutigen Abends präsentieren zu dürfen. Sie ist gebürtige Belgierin, sie ist Professorin für politische Theorie an der University of Westminster in London, studierte an der Louvain-Universität in Paris und in Essex, hatte Lehr- und Forschungsaufträge eigentlich weltweit an zahlreichen Universitäten in Europa, in Nord- und Lateinamerika, darunter solche Unis wie Harvard, Cornell, University of California, Princeton oder auch im Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris. Sie ist Herausgeberin von Bänden wie Gramsci and the Marxist Theory, Dimensions of Radical Democracy, Deconstruction and Paradigm, The Challenge of Carl Schmitt oder auch mit ihrem Co-Autor Ernesto Maclau, Hegemony and Socialist Strategy Towards a Radical Democratic Politics. Ihr letztes, gerade auf Deutsch erschienenes Buch, Agonistik, die Welt politisch denken, gerade 2014 neu herausgekommen, wird eines der Grundlagen für den heutigen Vortrag bilden. Und sie arbeitet aktuell auch in zahlreichen Forschungsprojekten über den Aufstieg der Rechtspopulisten in Europa und die Rolle von Europa in einer multipolaren Weltordnung. Ich persönlich freue mich besonders, Sie heute Abend einzuleiten, weil mir ein Aspekt Ihrer Arbeit als Journalistin und als Autorin selbst besonders wichtig ist. Sie ist keine, die behauptet, die endgültigen Antworten gefunden zu haben oder dass es überhaupt mal um die endgültigen Antworten in erster Linie geht, sondern vor allem darum, die richtigen Fragen zu stellen. Und diese Fragen auch dann zu stellen und gerade dann zu stellen, wenn sie unbequem sind, wenn sie radikal sind und wenn sie damit radikal unbequem sind. Fragen zu stellen, zu konfrontieren, das ist die Grundlage für jede Veränderung. Insofern, ja, schönen Abend, herzlich willkommen hier. We are really happy to have you here to talk to us tonight. Good evening and welcome, Chantal Mouffe. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Let me see what I need to. It's a pleasure to be in France, invited by the Full Academy. I've been here several times before, but it was mainly Irish as so to reach out. My voice is really, I don't know what's happening. I hope it's not going to disappear completely. Yes, so I've been here several times, but mostly in the context of the Irish assent, and it's the first time I'm at this university, so this is interesting.
When we envisage the present state of democracy, one of the assertions that we often come across is that our condition is one of post-democracy. So I've just heard Colin Croce is going to be here later on in this series of conferences. Well, he's one of those with conductor, but also in another way, Jacques Rancière in France. So this term post-democracy comes from different origins. And of course, Jacques Rancière being more on the side of philosophy and aesthetics, while Colin Croce is sociology and political science. So probably the different audiences refer to their work. But so the meaning conveyed by this notion of post-democracy, particularly in the way it is developed by Colin Croce, is that modern democracies, modern democracies which we live today, while maintaining the facade of former democratic principles, are increasingly controlled by privileged elites. The implementation of neoliberal policies has led to the colonization of the state by corporate interest, and crucial political decisions are now taken outside the democratic channels. The loss of legitimacy of democratic institutions manifests itself in a growing phenomenon of depoliticization. Well, I agree, and that of course is very, very, very roughly presented, like pure democracy. Well, I agree with many aspects of this analysis, but I think that when we examine the reason for this phenomenon of post-democracy and envisage how we could reverse this tendency, it's important to stress the role that parties of the left have played in the process of disaffection with politics, and that is an element not really much studied by people who work in post-democracy. In the book previous to this one, Agonistic, which is only political, also translated by Surkamp, Über das Politische, I have examined the reason for what I call, for my part, the post-political perspective, which has become dominant in liberal democratic societies. The post-political and post-democratic are in fact refer to the same thing but seen from different angles. Post-democracy tend to more see on the economic aspect, while post-political is really very much to do with the political consequence or the political mood, the zeitgeist which accompany this post-democracy. So, and I call this and by post-political, by the way, I want to insist is not that we are not we are in a period where there is no more politics. What I want to say is that is a period where we are not able to think in political terms. But you know, it is something, and that's something which is a real problem in my view. But this is definitively something which has become dominant in our democratic societies. And on the political, over as politician, I have argued that this is linked to the move toward the center, which in the last decade has been the strategy of social democratic parties in Europe. A strategy which, under the motto of the third way, was first elaborated for New Labour in Britain by Anthony Giddens, the sociologist. And of course, then it was put in practice politically by Tony Blair. According to such an approach of the third way, Western societies have entered a second stage of modernity, what they call reflexive modernization, where the adversarial model of politics, which is characteristic of the first stage of modernity, called the simple modernization, have become obsolete. This thesis has also been developed in Germany by Ulrich Beck. So from that point of view, both Beck and Giddens present this same idea that we are now in the second modernity. They claim that, and that is particularly in the case of Giddens, that it is not necessary to think beyond left and right, and of course this is also the title of a book by Tony Diddens. And they envisage a new type of politics of what they call radical center, which transcends the old-fashioned divide between left and right. Well, such a view was later adopted by other socialist and social democratic parties. So it began, in fact, it began in Britain, moved to Germany with Beck, and of course the neue Mitte of Schröder. And then, of course, they began to develop in other countries in Europe. And what is characteristic of this move is that those parties which used to be called socialist or labor or social democrat, now they call themselves center-left. And that, I think, clearly indicates that they are rejecting their former anti-capitalist element. Because, of course, social democracy was different. You know, Marx is not straightly anti-capitalist, but there was always some element of anti-capitalism in social democracy. And those are the elements which have been completely discarded by this new center-left third wave. Under the pretense of modernizing the social democratic project so as to adapt it to a globalized world, center-left parties have in fact capitulated to neoliberalism. Convinced that there was no alternative anymore to the current form of globalized financial capitalism, they have accepted the framework established by neoliberal hegemony. Having abandoned any attempt to challenge the existing relation of power, they now limit themselves to propose ways to humanize, so to speak, neoliberal globalization. So a little bit more redistribution than the center-right, but basically accept the same terrain of neoliberalism. And of course, this is why the policies of the center-left are very hard to distinguish from those of the center-right. And this is what I call the post-political situation, where there is basically no difference. And in my view, politics should necessarily be partisan. You really need to have different projects. If you don't have that, if you have this consensus at the center, so we are not, I think what I call the post-political situation. It is my contention that this consensus at the center has very negative consequences for democratic politics. Indeed, it is the absence of a real choice between clearly distinguishable alternatives which explain the current lack of interest in politics, which is really something that is typical of our societies, and this has, of course, produced a drastic fall in participation in the election. I mean, more and more we see a phenomenon of abstention. Another consequence of the conversion between center-right and center-left parties is that in several countries, such a situation has favored the emergence of right-wing populist parties. Parties whose success, and that's one of my theses in the book, is due to the fact that they appear as the only one that offer an alternative to the existing order. You know, they are, of course, to the establishment, center-right and center-left seen basically united, and they're saying, no, we are really going to offer an alternative to this establishment, and we are going to give the people a voice. And this is, I think, why they are successful, because within the context of the center-right and center-left, there is really no possibility to choose for an alternative. So the terrain is taken for people outside the traditional parties to say, no, there is an alternative. And in my view, this is really at the origin of the development of right-wing populist parties. And it seems to me that in discussion about post-democracy, the role played by this post-political situation is not sufficiently taken into account. It is, of course, necessary to grasp the transformation of the capitalist system, which have provided the economic condition for the success of neoliberal globalization. And I think that that's basically something that post-democracy addresses. But that does not automatically explain the reason for the disappearance of a vibrant democratic debate about the different ways in which social relation and public institution can be organized. The development of this form of capitalism does not automatically entail the post-political. And it is, I think, where the responsibility of the parties of the left, of center-left, needs to be recognized. By failing to acknowledge that politics is intrinsically partisan, and that democratic politics require what I've called an agonistic debate among conflicting projects, and a choice between real alternatives. This is what I call an agonistic debate. When you have a debate and there are really different projects, so parties of right and left who offer a choice, a real decision, and not the same kind of politics with a little bit different things. So, and for me, of course, if you don't have agonistic debate, you don't really have a democracy, because citizens are not given a choice. And because of the lack of this agonistic debate, the consensual politics of the third way is contributing to the depoliticization, which is at the core of our post-democratic condition. So you see that the two aspects need to be examined separately. When citizens feel that they cannot have a say in the fundamental decision which concerns their common affair, in that political question, are dealt with by experts because they are considered of a technical nature. I mean, this is of course clear. If the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization, and this is what center-right and center-left accept. Okay, but in that case, there is really no political question to be discussed in terms of alternatives. It means that political questions are technical issues. They are not issues on which you can make a real political decision. And if they are technical issues, then they are better dealt by experts. You see, so there is a real logic in this evolution. And this is what is typical of the post-political view. It's experts who should decide about those issues. It's not the people. But I think that, of course, it leads to a situation in which democratic institutions are empty of their substance and their legitimacy is threatened. Elections are reduced to providing a rubber stamp for measures imposed by a variety of actors whose interests are not publicly accountable, at a big transnational corporation, of course. And then the democratic process really loses its raison d'être. To be sure, our society still claims to be democratic. But what is the meaning of democracy in our post-political times? Well, here I think that one can be held by something, a reflection that I developed in a book which is still previous to Über's Politischer, and which is called The Democratic Paradox. It's also a book translated in German, but in this case it's published by Korean Camp in Austria. In The Democratic Paradox, I brought to the fore the tension existing between what I call the two ethico-political principles of this democracy. Here I want to specify, I can speak of liberal democracy, but not, of course, in the sense of liberalism, economic liberalism. So when I speak of liberal democracy, I speak of political form of society, which can be called so, and I prefer in fact, to speak about pluralist democracy. But basically, I was a Western model of democracy. So, and on the democratic paradox, I show in fact how this liberal democracy should be understood as the articulation of two different traditions. On one side, we've got the liberal tradition of the rule of law, individual rights, so political liberalism, nothing to do with capitalism at this stage, and then the democratic tradition of popular sovereignty and tradition which insists on the question of equality. So we've got here two different traditions with their different central values: liberty for the liberalism, equality for the democratic tradition, and this is why I say that the ethical political principle of this liberal democracy are liberty and equality. And one must have some people refer to put it fraternity, but I think the term for all, because of course in the moment in which democracy became universal in the sense that they want more exclusion, because it took a long time, of course, for women to be considered as equal. In this, and of course, even before that, there was a time in which only a certain categories of men were considered as insignificant. But today, in our society, we can say that there is principle, a firm principle, which of course doesn't mean that they are put into practice. No? That's another affair. But liberty and equality for all. Well, this, and I want to insist on it because I think it's important, articulation between liberalism and democracy, there is nothing necessary. For instance, here I disagree with Habermas when he speaks about the co-originality of the principle of liberty and equality. I think that the Canadian political theorist C.B. Machtvoll is right when he said that no, this is in fact the result of an historical articulation. And it took place in the 19th century, the moment in which there was an union, which was established in the people struggling for equality, the Democrats and the Liberals, in their common fight against absolutism. Macpherson showed that very well in a very nice little book, which is called The Knife and Times of Liberal Democracy. He showed that all this happened in the 19th century. And he showed how, through this articulation, liberalism was democratized and democracy was liberalized. And this is what really led to our present kind of regime. But what's important here to stress is that there was always a tension between the exigencies of liberty and the exigencies of equality. In fact, there is a whole discussion, both how can they be combined, and obviously one must accept that you cannot have perfect equality and perfect liberty together. Now, there is always one of the elements which is going to have the primacy. So there is in fact what I propose to call a tension between those principles. And in fact, it's a tension which I think is an important, it's positive tension, because it is something which allows for the possibility of pluralism in the dynamics of the confrontation between left and right, up till now. In fact, we could say that the history of democratic politics can be visualized in terms of the struggle for the predominance of one or of those principles over the other. In some period, the liberal aspect was dominant, in other, it was the democratic one. But the contestation remained open. The struggle between left and right was who was going to become the predominant, in my vocabulary, to obtain the hegemony. What has happened with our current situation under the hegemony of neoliberalism is that the liberal component in a very specific understanding of which is precisely what is called neoliberalism, a certain understanding of liberty, because in the tradition of liberal political philosophy, you have very different understanding of liberty. There is, for instance, a very different understanding if we find liberty in the work of Stuart Mill or in the work of Hayek, for instance. And obviously the understanding of liberty, which has become dominant, is a neoliberal understanding. And it's true that I think it's characteristic of neoliberalism that the liberal component has become so dominant that the democratic component is almost disappeared. In fact, the proof of that is that democracy is not understood simply in terms of rule of law, defense of human rights, but everything that has got to do with the idea of popular sovereignty is considered as being obsolete. If you speak about popular sovereignty, that is completely archaic. It's not something that is can be implemented today. And I think that's the consequence of the fact that the liberal component is really put aside the democratic aspect. Those who resist the rule of the elites and insist on the need to give a voice to the people, to make room for their demand, are dismissed as being populist. In fact, as we are going to see in a moment, in a sense, I want to revindicate the term populist. I don't accept that this is something that should be discarded. I think we need to really find it in a progressive way, because it's too easy. Every group that challenges the status quo is populism. Of course, some of those forms are to be criticized, and some of those forms are important. But that will come in a moment. In my view, the displacement of the democratic tradition by the liberal one is one of the main features of our post-democratic condition. And it is clearly visible in the abandon by center-left parties of the struggle for equality. Their main slogan is today about choice, fairness, equity, inclusion. For example, one of the last campaigns of Tony Blair was choice. Choice is good. Choice and of course very much linked to the idea of privatization. Privatization is going to be the choice. Why? When it's the state who intervene, then of course, we don't have choice. So I think this is really very important with this change of focus in the term. But in fact, they take pains to avoid speaking of equality, because most of them consider that it's dangerous to speak of equality today. It's too much tainted by the equalitarianism of the socialist idea, and of course it's something which is very much linked to the crisis of the communists and the collapse of the communist model. So we can't speak anymore about equality, because equality automatically refers to Soviet equalitarianism, and this should not be a slogan today. That's what the center-left people believe. Deprived of the vocabulary that constituted the backbone of its vision of society, because the idea of equality is at the center of the idea of the left. It's not surprising then that the left is not able to envisage an alternative to neoliberal globalization. And I want to insist that without abandoning the consensus of the center, this type of politics, which is for me one of the cause of the progressive irrelevance of democratic institutions, then there is no hope of escaping the post-democratic trend. So in order to escape post-democracy, we need to put into question the post-political situation between center consensus, between center-right and center-left. That it is necessary to fight against the blurring of the line between left and right, and to put forward a clearly defined progressive project. Of course, the blurring between left and right, I'm not negating that, denying that it has happened, something which really empirically exists. But the question is that, is it something good, positive, or is it not? Is it something that needs to be put into question? because I think that's such a blurry, patchy, what third-way theorists affirm, far from constituting a progress, a move toward a supposedly more mature democracy, because that's what Giddens and Beck say. No, we are doing more antagonism, and no difference between left and right, and that is good. We as a society become more mature, but I don't agree with that. I think that in fact it could lead to the demise of democracy. It is urgent to revive the democratic process, and this can only be done by progressive parties launching a counter-hegemonic offensive against the neoliberal attempt to destroy the central institution of the welfare state and to privatize the whole of social life, subjecting it to the rule of the market. My diagnostic is that we are witnessing a crisis of representation, and that is a consequence of this consensus at the center, which has become dominant in most liberal democratic societies. This consensus, as I've already stressed, is the result of the unchallenged hegemony of neoliberalism. For that, there is no alternative to neoliberalism. And it deprives democratic citizens of an agonistic debate, a debate when they could make their voice heard and choose between real alternatives. So this is analysis of our current situation. Well, it's interesting to see that till rather recently, the rejection of this consensus at the center had come primarily from right-wing populist parties. And it had been articulated, of course, in a xenophobic language. Fortunately, we have recently begun to witness a different kind of challenge to that consensus at the center. And that took place thanks to the development of a series of protest movements, for instance, the different Occupy or the Indignado movements. With those protests, what we have seen is the emergence of other ways, certainly much more estimable, of reacting against the democratic deficit that characterizes our post-democratic societies. Of course, in both cases, what is at stake is a profound disaffection with the current order. Because I think that when one analyzes right-wing populism, we should not just dismiss that, on the basis of, too often the case, moral condemnation. One needs to try to understand why these things happen. Why is it that more and more sector of the popular classes are voting for parties like the right-wing populists? And I think that in many cases those parties are able, and their success comes from the fact that they articulate real democratic demand, but of course they articulate it, they frame it in a way which is really xenophobic and unacceptable. But their success comes from the fact that they really speak to what the people want, and the fact that they feel that the other parties don't take the demand into account. So it's the fact that the way those demands are articulated is problematic. And it's too easy to just dismiss that. In fact, I think it's one understands the tendency for center-left parties to do that, because of course it's a way in which they to prevent them having to make an autocritique, because if they were really making an autocritique, they would realize that it is because they moved toward the center, they are left the interest of the popular classes that this is happened. So it's much more easy for them to dismiss and say, no, that they're fascist, neo-Nazi, and things like that. So I think it's important to realize that there is, in both cases, real malaise, but of course that can be articulated in many different ways. And of course what is clear in those different kind of reaction, I mean, both left and right, that people have lost faith in traditional parties, and that they feel that their voice cannot be heard through traditional political channels. Here, for instance, I think one of the motto of the Indignados protest, I will show it, I mean, it exactly express it. They were saying, we have a vote, but we don't have a voice. And this is really the situation. You have a vote, yeah, you can vote. But since there is basically no fundamental difference, no real alternative between the parties of center, right, and left, for which you are going to vote, and of course in the case of in Spain, between the PSOE and the Partido Popular, it's about they don't have a voice. And I think that's really where there is a crisis of representation in our post-political, post-democratic societies. So this is something which it's interesting to see first this rejection of the concept of the center, mainly from the right populism. Now we've got protest movement, which are also putting into question the establishment. But of course, the question is that how are we going to interpret those recent protest movements? Because we are all saying, yeah, that's good, at least things are moving on the progressive side. And here, of course, there are really important divergences. I mean, there is one aspect in which there is some kind of broad agreement, because to say, well, those protests reveal a profound political malaise vis-à-vis democratic institutions. And in fact, they bring to the fore the crisis of those institutions. It is in fact with respect to the causes of such a crisis, and particularly the remedies that are needed that opinion diverge. Many theorists influenced by the approach which is developed by Michael Hart and Tony Negri in their trilogy Multitude, first Empire, Multitude and Commonwealth, which is called the Exodus approach, the approach of desertion. People who are influenced by that approach see in recent mobilization, the protests of Occupy and Indignados, a manifestation of the power of the multitude. Multitude constructing new form of social relation outside traditional institutions. Because of course those movements tend to say that we don't want to engage with parties, we don't want to have anything to do with traditional institutions, and we want what some people call a presentist democracy. And the people who interpret those movements under the light of those desertion theorists celebrate them with the realization of the common, and they present their encampments as a prefiguration of absolute democracy, the moment in which the multitude will auto-organize itself. That's what this is defended by Tony Negri and Michael Hart in the trilogy. For them, those movements are characteristic of the new form of struggle, of the precarious work of the famous precariat, typical of post-Fordism. And they argue, for instance, that what the Spanish Indignados, with their call for democracia real, real democracy, no. What they advocate is not so much, they say direct democracy, a democracy in which all citizens would be able to participate, because they feel that this is still too representative. What they really advocate is a radically different form of democracy, a democracy beyond representation. They call that a democracy in actu, or presentist democracy. But in any case, this is this presentist democracy is seen as the opposite of representative democracy. It's a matter of collective political practices without any claim to government. And they say that those protest, express rejection of any form of representation altogether, and that they express a total rejection of liberal democracy. So that is the way in which there's tendency to interpret the protest. Well, in agonistic, I've presented another interpretation. In my view, and also to the refusal of the post-political order, current protests can be read as a call for radicalization of liberal democratic institutions, not for their rejection. What they exact are better, more inclusive form of representation. To satisfy their demand for voice, remember what I say, you know, we vote and not the voice, so we need to find a way to give them a voice. Well, to satisfy the demand for voice, existing representative institutions have to be transformed and new ones need to be established so as to create the condition for an agonistic confrontation, that is a situation in which people would be offered real alternatives. Such a confrontation you require not a strategy of withdrawal from existing institutions, not a strategy of desertion, of exodus, but a strategy of engagement with those institutions in order, of course, to transform them profoundly. This is what I call a strategy of radicalization of democracy. And it requires the emergence of a progressive project that will be able to offer an alternative to the social liberal consensus dominant in central practice. So for me, the only way to get out of this post-political, post-democratic situation in which we live today, not by withdrawing from the traditional institution, by engaging with them. And of course, that requires a project that offers an alternative to neoliberalism. What we can call the citizen, in fact, I prefer the expression that the citizen awakening that took place in Europe and of course also to the USA with Occupy, is something of course which is very encouraging because it breaks with the post-political consensus. A taboo has been broken and many voices have been heard contesting the inequalities existing in our society. So this is definitely something that I think was positive. But to effectively challenge neoliberal hegemony, because I think that those protests are not enough to really do an important self-change. To effectively challenge neoliberalism, but it is crucial that all the energies that have erupted in those movements are not diverted towards the wrong alley. And I am afraid that this is what will happen if representative institutions become the target of those protests. There is no denying that representative institutions are in crisis in their current liberal democratic form, or in their current, I would rather say, post-democratic form. So there is crisis of representation, as I was saying before, but this crisis of representation of the way in which those institutions exist at the moment. And this is the reason why I do not believe that the solution lies in the establishment of a non-representative democracy, that it will lead them to discard those institutions completely. The representative institutions, not only their actual form, but completely get rid of representative institutions. This is what, of course, the people who follow the line of the exodus are claiming. And so for me, the solution is not to establish a non-representative democracy. And on the other side, I also believe that, contrary again to those theories, civil society movement do not constitute the only possible vehicle for making democratic advances. Of course, the views are popular because they're shy with the idea, it is fashionable in one sector of the left, that the multitude could auto-organize itself, avoiding taking power and becoming state. But I think that to find certain, for me, this is an anti-political approach, and to find this among the activists involved in the various movements of the outrage, I think it's worrying, because it forecloses the possibility of designing an adequate strategy for their struggle. When representative institutions have seen as the problem, where representation, the fact of representation is seen as the problem, then of course the end cannot be to engage with current institutions to transform them, to make them more representative. Because, of course, the aim will be to discard them. It's not a question of making those institutions more accountable, more representative, to discard them altogether. And that is one of the lines of those sectors of the movement. And of course, according to such a view, the objective of the movement should be visualized in terms of an exodus from the given form of democracy, on the ground that attempting to transform existing institutions is vain, and that representative democracy is to be relinquished. I mean, this is a thesis that we find among those groups. Let's say that many among those who reject representation will because they identify representative democracy with its current post-democratic form and with the actual working of the parliamentary system. I think that they do not see that the problem concerns not democratic institutions, the representative institutions in themselves, but the way in which they function at the moment. So what needs to be challenged is the lack of alternative offered to the citizen, not the very idea of representation. A pluralist democratic society cannot exist without representation. To begin with, the anti-essentialist approach, and that is the approach that we developed with Ernesto Laclau in the book that we wrote together, Hegemony Socialist Strategy. If you follow this anti-essentialist approach, identities are never already given, but always produced through identification. This process of identification is the process of representation. So it is through representation that collective political subjects are created. They do not exist beforehand. Every assertion of a political identity is thereby interior, not exterior to the process of representation. This is the first point, that we don't have collective political identities without representation. And secondly, and also it's very important, in a democratic society where pluralism is not envisaged as the harmonious anti-political form where everybody could finally agree, and where the ever-present possibility of antagonism is taken into account, then representative institutions, by giving form to the division of society, play a crucial role in allowing for the institutionalization of the conflictual dimension. Because without representation, you cannot have an institutionalization of conflict, and that is central in democracy. However, such a role can only be fulfilled through the availability of an agonistic confrontation. And what constitutes the central problem with our current post-political model is the absence of such an agonistic confrontation. So for me, this is the central problem. The fact that consensus at the center, lack of agonism, and therefore crisis of representation. And of course, such a situation is not going to be remedied through horizontalist practices. This is why I think it's very important to see the struggle in terms of what I call engagement with institutions and not an exodus from institutions. Well, I have argued a little bit earlier that in order to address the crisis of representative democracy and to foster an agonistic debate, what is needed is the formulation of a progressive project, offering an alternative to our current post-democratic condition which is due, I repeat it, to neoliberal hegemony. I don't want to explain why I think that such a project should take the form of what I call a left-wing populist movement. As I have already suggested, the crisis of representative democracy is not a crisis of representative democracy per se, but a crisis of its current post-democratic incarnation. It is due to the lack of an agonistic debate, which is a consequence of the consensus of the center being established between center-right and center-left parties. So that was the center of the first part of my intervention. In order to foster an agonistic debate, so this is the question, see, if the problem comes from the absence of an agonistic debate, then the solution is to foster an agonistic debate. How are we going to do that? Well, here my point is that we need then to construct a political frontier, because agonistic debates require that there are alternatives, that there is really, recognition that there are different projects. So this is what I call establishing a frontier, between different projects. And here, of course, one could say, I must say that on the political, published in 2005, I was already interested and preoccupied with this question, but I was still thinking that the solution was to revivify the left-right confrontation. Let's say, for instance, basically, concretely, that the social democratic parties will really recover their left-wing identity and begin to offer an alternative to neoliberal globalization. Well, I don't believe that anymore. Because since what happened since 2005, we got the crisis in 2008, and then it became very clear that in most countries, I would say those parties were beyond repair. Because they had really become too complicit with neoliberal globalization. They were, and Britain, France, couldn't want to say exactly if the situation is similar in Austria, but I believe so. In most of those countries, it is social democratic parties which have really established the privatization and they have not done something very different. So that liberalize and to privatize, and then of course in 2008, the state need to come to our rescue, but of course it was the rescue of the bank, but it was a moment where Social Democrats could have said, you see that the state is important, we need the state, and take the opportunity to advance redistributive policies to reestablish, but of course they did not do that. They accepted the move was to restore the bank, and of course they have also accepted the policies of austerity which have been imposed, a so-called solution to the problem. So they are too complicit with their identity and their fate is too much linked with neoliberal globalization. One cannot imagine that they could suddenly, change and become present projects which are anti-neoliberal. So this is why I don't think anymore that it's possible. I mean, I'm not saying that it's completely impossible, but maybe in some cases where you will have social democratic parties which are still really with a strong anti-neoliberal component, but when I look around in Europe, unfortunately, I don't see any of them. So this is why I came to the conclusion that the frontier needed to be. It was not simply re-establishing the left character of the social democratic parties, but creating a new form of movement, to create and of course that implied to establish a frontier, you know, between those people. It's true, they become part of the establishment. So no one, what is needed is to establish people, a populist movement. I think it's against the because populism taken as an analytical category, and because there, of course, too much. I think populism is just demagogy, populism. But I think that we need to absolutely leave aside those things which are not serious. Populism, and here I refer particularly to the way in which it is defined by Nestor Laclau, the populist reason. They say, well, populism is nothing to do with the content. Populism is simply a way of constructing the political, constructing a frontier between the people and the establishment. Then, of course, you need the people, the establishment that can take many different forms, but it's basically the way to establish a frontier. And I think that this is really what is needed today. And particularly since this terrain is already being occupied by right-wing populism. You know, and they've got some advance, I think, in order to fight against right-wing populism. The only way is to develop some form of left-wing populism. So what is at stake, I think, is the creation of a collective will. This is a term from Gramsci. Thanks to the establishment of a chain of equivalence between, that's a concept that we develop in the hegemonic socialist strategy, between a variety of democratic demands existing in our societies. We need to mobilize in a counter-hegemonic project a manifold of democratic forces. And for that, it is vital to establish a synergy between party and various progressive civil society movements. This is for me what is really specific of what I call left-wing populism. So left-wing populism, first of all, need to offer an alternative to neoliberal globalization, to be against neoliberal globalization, but also it cannot just be a party which is a party movement. You know, the term populism precisely refers to the fact that it must, of course, it's something that needs to have some kind of institutional structure, because it's a party that intends to come to power, accept representation, but of course in order to profoundly transform it. And I think that it's important to have this articulation between movement and party, because it seems to be clear that the multiplicity of democratic demands that exist today cannot be all expressed through the verticalist form of the party. Even if we envisage this party as a reform, transform party, because many of those demands of the social movement, in fact, emerge through horizontalist form, and it's not possible nor desirable, I would say, to try to force them in the verticalist mode. So what is needed is a new form of political organization that could articulate the two modes. And here, I think that one can already give some example of this. For instance, Syriza in Greece is definitely an example of what I call a left-wing populist party. And Podemos in Spain is also an example of this kind of party movement. And I think that it's really important to see that the way in which we can revivify the democracy is through the development of such a movement. I want to maybe say something about Europa too, because I see it's already late. Well, I think that obviously things are not going to change. Only, I mean, I think in the same way as I was arguing, we need a party and movement. We need a synergy between different forms. But that cannot be envisaged limited only at the national level. Because, and we are already seeing, with the difficulties of Syriza in Greece. And when you got the rest of the European Union against you, it's not easy. And of course, I'm not of those who believe that the solution then is to abandon the European Union. And no, I think that we really need a democratic refoundation of Europe. This is for me the only way forward. But the democratic refoundation of Europe, of course, need to be the result of the development of what let's call it European left-wing populism. European left-wing populism, which of course will have a different basis. You know, I'm not thinking of some kind of movement that has nothing to do with, which is only at the European level, which has nothing to do with the different countries. What we need is both, you know, to work organization at the national level, so a left-wing populist parties fighting at the national level, but also some kind of synergy of those parties at the level. There is already, I mean, something, the embryo of that, which is the European left party, I think it's called it, where you got Syriza, when you got Podemos, when you got the Linke in Germany, because the Linke for me is also an example of this kind of left-wing populism. So we need to establish a coordination of the to create that those different national movements will, of course, work together in order to really profoundly transform Europe, what I call a democratic refoundation of Europe. Because if that does not happen, if the struggle is not also taking place at the European level, it's going to be very difficult for those parties when they come to power in their countries to fight, you know, against the European Union that would be really united in defending neoliberalism. So I say, well, we don't know what's going to happen in Greece, unfortunately. Greece might, in the end, be forced out of the euro. And I think it would be really something very negative for Greece and for Europe. But it's certainly not what they want. I mean, I think the Tsipras government has been making a lot of move in order to stay in the euro, but euro and in Europe, of course. But I think that this shows the need, you know, for if really we want to get out of this post-democratic conditions and this political, we need to fight both at national level and at the European level in order to develop a left-wing populist movement. Thank you. I'm going to sit more. Yeah, sure. I come back. Yeah.
So, bevor wir jetzt in die Diskussion gehen, ankündigt noch ein kurzer Kommentar von Lautwaschel und dann bitte Fragen überlegen und wir gehen dann direkt in die erste.
Ja. Vielen herzlichen Dank, dass Sie heute die Gelegenheit gegeben haben, zu einem Vortrag auch einen Kommentar abzugeben. Wobei es mir ausgegangen ist, dass genau diese Theorien natürlich eigentlich mehr Fragen aufwerfen, als sie Antworten, oder als ich zumindest Antworten habe. Mein Zugang ist ja kein wissenschaftlicher, auch nicht mein Zugang zur Politik. Mein Zugang ist ja sehr praktischer, nämlich über das Tun und über das, dass vieles, was in dieser neoliberalen Gesellschaft passiert, was uns zu Verhaltensweisen einfach zwingt, gegen die man sich eigentlich nur widersetzen kann oder eigentlich nur wirklich mit Widerstand reagieren kann. Und für mich persönlich war da ein konkreter Auslöser vor 5 Jahren ein Erlebnis, also ein Kinofilm, das war der Film Plastic Planet, und daraufhin das Gefühl, diese Art der Verschwendung, die eigentlich da passiert, diese Art, wie eine ganze, oder wie Industrie, wie Konzerne, wie eben das neoliberale System uns zu Verhaltensweisen zwingt eigentlich, der fühle ich mich ohnmächtig ausgeliefert eigentlich als Einzelne. Und mein persönlicher Zugang war dann Widerstand. Ja. Ich habe dann in diesem, oder gleich direkt anschließend an den Film, beschlossen, ich mache mit meiner Familie ein Experiment, wir wollen 1 Monat lang plastikfrei leben. Wir haben das auch dann gemacht, wir haben auch bis jetzt ziehen wir das irgendwie so durch, aber woran man immer wieder stößt, ist eben etwas, was mir in dem Vortrag auch so extrem aufgefallen ist. Es ist so starker, wie Sie sagen, eine Verfestigung des Systems, an das alle Leute glauben. Ja? Also dieses System scheint unumstößlich. Ich merke das ganz oft, also ich habe ein Buch geschrieben dazu, Plastikfreie Zone, und habe da viele Lesungen, Vorträge, wo ich immer wieder versuche, Menschen für diesen Widerstand zu begeistern. Nämlich nicht nur Widerstand gegen Plastik, das ist eigentlich mittlerweile nur mehr ein Vehikel für mich, sondern Widerstand gegen das, was da passiert insgesamt. Ja? Und da kommt es ganz oft in den Diskussionen, erstens das Gefühl, dass die Menschen haben, man kann nichts tun, das System ist so stark, es ist unveränderbar. Und dann kann man auch lustige Dinge wie, einmal habe ich mit einem Kunststofftechniker da lang diskutiert, weil der gemeint hat, er findet das alles super, was wir da machen, und das stimmt, dass das alles viel zu viel und verschwenderisch ist und eigentlich immer nur die Großen davon profitieren. Aber wenn jetzt alle so täten wie wir, dann hätten wir ganz, ganz viele Arbeitslose und überhaupt nicht alles den Bach runtergehen. Und ja, das ist mir jetzt heute wieder so eingefallen bei diesem Vortrag. Ne? Also es erhält sich in den Argumentationszyklen dann immer wieder das System. Ne? Es wird immer wieder hoch argumentiert. Ja, also ich habe ganz viele Fragen eigentlich. Ich will euch ja gar nicht lange jetzt von der Diskussion abhalten. Für mich das Wichtigste oder die wichtigste Frage, die mir auf der Seele brennt, ist, wie kann man diese, also es wurde jetzt so genannt, linkspopulistische Bewegung, und ich bin ja doch auch jetzt Mitglied einer Partei oder engagiere mich auch politisch, weil ich daran glaube, dass es einen Systemwandel gab. Also ich glaube es nicht nur, das ist die einzige Hoffnung, die ich sehe, also es braucht einen Systemwandel. Wie kann man über alle Kanäle, die irgendwie verfügbar sind, wirklich daran arbeiten? Also so konkret, also für mich wäre noch vielleicht die Hauptfrage, was können Parteien tun, um die Bewegungen zu stärken und Bewegungen, um diese politische Auseinandersetzung dorthin zu gehen, dass sie wieder agonistisch wird. Das ist mir jetzt noch nicht so ganz klar, aber wahrscheinlich gibt es darauf auch keine einfache Antwort. Ja, das war es eigentlich schon von meiner Seite. Ich kann nur dazu aufrufen oder diese Begeisterung für Widerstand gegen dieses System versuchen, immer wieder weiterzugeben. Und ja, ich freue mich auf eine spannende Diskussion und hoffe, dass zumindest ein paar so kleine Antworten dann im Laufe des Abends auch noch dazu kommen. Danke für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Als erste Einstiegsfrage, perfekt.
No, I think that this we should have other question, because this is a question which are going to be.
Okay, dann fangen wir bitte vorne gleich.
I would like to pose one question. I'm coming from European periphery, and especially because we are talking now about Europe, but how? European Union, from our point of view, but also objective, is very unequal development is producing inside of European Union. Especially, and if we say this center, left, right, center consensus, either if we call it neoliberal or ordoliberal, what is most in the case of European Union, I think this center is saying one thing, and this is let's ensure the conditions, suitable conditions for a new world contribution to a new capitalistic accumulation. These relations that are inside, on this base, is also the whole, how to say, architecture of European Union is made. What is a special problem for us from periphery? Because one thing, and here this is exactly, Syriza case is showing that there is an alternative to this consensus, and this is recall of that. But immediately when this is on the post, on the European level, it's a problem. And this is not a problem of elite, it's a problem of a small people, small, but it's a problem of masses. It's a problem of opinion. Here in this, I think, is not just because the people are thinking. I think to this contributes a lot of this institutional setup of European Union. Not only that the ECB ECB, central bank, is one of the main institutions, but also how the institutions are posed, and also how we, for example, if periphery is starting to fight, which is also in Syria a case, but not only in Syria, also in other countries, where, for example, I'm coming from Slovenia, where it's exactly this issue, what you are saying. We had 2 years ago mass protests against government, against privatization, against diminishing of welfare states. It was a huge protest in, actually the biggest protest in the history of independent Slovenia. What happened this, after protests, arose few parties. One was the left party, somehow on the principle of Syriza started together and came in the parliament, but the center stayed. And the diction here, and also is always the European Union, the conditions for indebting of countries are demanding the new privatization, welfare state, and so on. So I think this appealing only on movements and their representatives, so what I mean, only like articulating a discourse, it's not enough. I think the institutional setup will always block, not only on this formal level, but also because institutions are providing ideology, because institutions are providing a particular distinctive discourse. What, for example, in this, recalling the debts came out in European Union, that not only the governments, all European states said, no, Greeks have to pay, but also the public opinion was supporting the governments.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't really see what, because of, my whole point in the paper, presentation was that institutions need to be changed. You said relying only on the movement. I mean, precisely this is what I'm criticizing, the idea that it's only the movement. I'm insisting that it's very important to engage with the electoral politics, to engage with the institutional level. So that's on one point. A question of the European Union. You see, the question is that the European Union is the consequence of, it's not something there, like, you know, the enemy. European Union is neoliberal because all the parties in Europe are neoliberal. So the kind of people that they send there are neoliberal. So, I mean, it's too easy to just criticize, the problem is the European Union. No, the problem is the European Union because the European Union is the expression of what is the kind of politics in the different European states. So this is why I insist on the need to, it's only by bringing about, you know, progressive, really progressive government in each country that we are going to be able to create this democratic refoundation of Europe. Democratic refoundation of Europe is not going to be made by the actual government which are in power in Europe, of course. This is important, you know, and that's what I'm saying. Well, it's important. Imagine Podemos in Spain and Die Linke in Germany, and then you know, and then of course, starting from there, you will be able to transform Europe. But and I agree very much with what you are saying about the question of the people. Of course, is important. But the whole point of creating a left-wing populist movement is precisely to address the transform, the way in which, you know, the people is constructed, because at the moment, and I think that's the success of right-wing populism, comes from the fact that they try to construct a popular identity, but they try to construct it in a way which, of course, is to reinforce the national egoism, to reinforce the exclusion of the immigrant, to reinforce, and the left-wing populism is the way to fight against that, to create a new kind of people. I will give you one example of that, which is quite interesting and telling. In France, for instance, of course, you know, the most we've got a very strong right-wing populist movement with Marine Le Pen, which is very successful. It's really construct French people, but it constructs that by articulating a lot of demand. For instance, you know, the party in France who at the moment gets more vote from the working class is the national front, you know. And because, of course, the Socialist Party, you know, is completely dedicated to speak to the middle classes and does not consider the demand of the worker as being reactionary and you know, archaic, and they are left there, you know, nobody wants to. And Marine Le Pen, of course, they say, no, I'm going to speak for you, I'm going to give you a voice, I'm going to, but she articulates those demands in a way in which say, no, but the enemy is the immigrant, you know, so she constructs a collective will, which I think this is what is at stake in politics, a collective will, but she constructed in a way which, for instance, and the immigrants are not inside, you know, the immigrants are on the, because one of the points of my theory is that politics is always concerned with construction of us, and it always implies the determination of a them. But of course, the them can be constructed in very different ways. For instance, in the case of Marine Le Pen, the us is the good French people, but the them is the immigrants, and of course there is a very strong anti-European dimension, but which is more linked to the fact that it's because of Europe that we cannot really deal with the immigrants in the way we would like. Europe imposed onto us restriction to our sovereignty, but basically what it's at stake is the exclusion of the immigrants. But so you've got, you know, us, the good people, and then Jean-Luc Mélenchon, with the leader of the Front de Gauche, which is, in my view, the left-wing populist movement, unfortunately, far from as successful as Marine Le Pen, also want to construct the people. But he constructs the French people in a different way. The French people in which the immigrants are part of the French people. And the them is the transnational corporation, the forces of neoliberalism. You see, and this is a way of constructing the frontier in left-wing populism. And of course, it's going to completely transform the identity of the people. Because when you construct the people, the French people, in a way in which the enemy is not the immigrant, but the transnational corporation, it's going to create solidarity. You know, the very important point of the whole theory that we develop in hegemonic socialist strategy, that identities are never given, they are always constructed. They are result in politics in the great part construction of identity. So it's true that today, for instance, and it's rather worrying that there is so much popular support in many countries against the Greek, you know, and the Turk, well, you know, but that could change. That we need to fight against. That we need to construct other form of identities, and this is precisely what the left-wing populist project should do.
Ja. Wir müssen das Mikrofon also einfach für die Aufzeichnung, damit die Fragen auch gehört werden.
So, can you hear me?
Try again.
Okay.
Not a problem. Not a problem.
So, I think that I have understood your diagnosis, and I agree in part with it, in part I disagree. But what I haven't really understood is your perspective, your ultimate goal. Because, let me explain it. Once upon a time, the left wing had the wish to win irreversibly over the right wing, either through a democratic process or through a revolutionary process, and to create a classless society. Yeah. So, if I understand your position properly, you don't want this, because in that moment there will be no agonism, no that tension that you appreciate so much. So you actually want to go, if I understand your position properly, you want to go back a few decades or a century ago when good and right, real left position existed, and or democratic, or however we call it, and the liberal position, and there was this real tension between these two positions, and you want to recreate somehow this tension. So somehow you are left-wing, but you don't want the ultimate victory of the left. So don't you think it's a little bit reactionary?
I don't think there is I don't think there is any ultimate victory. I don't believe in the idea of a completely reconciled society under common. I mean, this is well, that is the element which is the central things of hegemony in socialist strategies, precisely to criticize this. And to assert that antagonism is ineradicable. There will always be antagonism in society. There is what we call a radical negativity, which impedes complete consensus and impede. We put into question the Marxist project of complete end of antagonism and communism. No, and in fact, the project. But what we propose is that in the book we propose to reformulate the socialist project in terms of a radicalization of democracy. So yeah, that's what the project of the left for me should be, to radicalize democracy. That is to develop, extend the principle of liberty and equality in many more social relations, knowing that there will never be the possibility of an absolute reconciliation, and that the idea of a really realized democracy is think of it. I mean, if we accept, of course, we might not accept that, but if we accept that one of the important things in democracy is pluralism, question of pluralism. Pluralism implies the possibility that there is always a way in which things can be contested. So if you will imagine a society, an endpoint, you say, okay, no, the society is really democratic. For instance, this is what I disagree with the idea of Art and an absolute democracy. Because they don't want to speak about communism, but they speak of absolute democracy. Okay, so we've arrived in the state in which absolute democracy is realized. What it means, of course, that one cannot challenge anything. For me, it's totalitarian, this thing, because it means that everybody who will, at some point, challenge a certain institution will be seen irrational or mad, or because, if the real democracy, if the absolute democracy is being realized, then of course we can't challenge. There is no more argument. Yeah, for me, but it's not that I wish. I think I'm saying this is. There is always conflict in society, and it's better to give the possibility to that conflict to be expressed through the political system than to negate that conflict. So I'm not saying it's not a wish. I'm just saying there is conflict, and it's better that this conflict be given the possibility of an agonistic function, because if it does not have the possibility of being institutionalized in an agonistic way, then it is going to take violent antagonistic form. But it's very long. I will need to go into a lot of philosophical reflection to explain that. But of course, no. The very premises of our talk is that there is absolute realization of democracy is unthinkable, and we better accept that and see the idea of socialism in terms of radicalization, of advances in democracy, putting into question, but knowing that there is never any end point.
May I just shortly ask, and to finish it, but this antagonism, when you are saying antagonism and tendencies and so on, are you meaning the class antagonism?
No.
What kind of antagonism?
No. Antagonism is, it can be a class antagonism, of course, but there are many more antagonism. An antagonism is a conflict that has no rational solution. A type of conflict that how much you get together and try to, you cannot, it's simply, well, this is why it's radical negativity. There is in society an element of radical negativity. There are conflicts which have no rational solution. But of course that conflict can take many forms. And I think, for instance, for me, if I see the difference between Marxism on one side and liberalism on the other, I think that for me what is positive in Marx, but for liberalism there is no conflict, no antagonism, there is basically no relation of power with structured society, politics take place in a neutral terrain, and then it's basically a question of who is going to occupy the place of power. So, but Marxism does recognize that there is antagonism in society, but they limit antagonism to class antagonism. And therefore they believe that, yes, once class antagonism is been overcome, we could arrive to a society without antagonism. And that's what I put into question, because I think that, of course, a class antagonism can be overcome. I'm not saying the contrary, but it doesn't mean because there are other forms of antagonism. And I think one of the problems, for instance, because when we wrote the Hegemony Socialist Strategy, what we were mainly trying to see, why is it that there is such a difficulty for Marxism to give account of the form of antagonism which are not class one. For instance, feminist struggle, the environmentalism, a series of things that everything to do with the new social movement. Traditional Marxist theory could not find ways to integrate them. And in fact, the whole aim of the Hegemony Socialist Strategy was precisely to reformulate the socialist project. I mean, the title is Hegemony Socialist Strategy towards a radical democratic politics. To say, in order to take account of the form of subordination which cannot be reduced to class, then we need to envisage the emancipatory project in a different way. But emancipatory without, inverted commas, saying that an absolute emancipation is not something that is ever possible.
We have 4 more questions now, and then I guess we're going to collect the questions. Yeah, okay? So Eva, Janice, here.
Ja, ich kann Ihren Thesen viel abgewinnen, dass die Konsensorientierung zur Depolitisierung, zur Entpolitisierung führt und diese Konzentration auf das Zentrum auch eine solche Entpolitisierung vorantreibt und daher die einzigen, die so politische Alternativen aufzeigen, unter Anführungszeichen rechtsradikale Parteien sind. Und meine Frage ist nun, an und für sich sind Grüne mit ökologischen Fragestellungen antreten vor 30 Jahren mit einem sehr radikalen Antagonismus, einem radikalen Widerspruch zu Kapitalismus. Mittlerweile, also nach etwa 30 Jahren Entwicklung, beobachte ich aber doch sehr stark, dass hier auch die Konzentration auf das Zentrum der Gesellschaft und die Konsensorientierung und teilweise eben auch der neoliberale Konsens in diesen grünen Parteien sehr stark Überhand nimmt. Und würde mich interessieren, wie Sie das sehen, ob Sie das ähnlich sehen mittlerweile wie die Sozialdemokratie, das heißt, dass man keine Hoffnung mehr darin hat, oder ob Sie hier noch Möglichkeiten sehen, dass man eine radikalere Gesellschaftspolitik von grünen Parteien noch erwarten kann.
I would like to answer to that question. Look, I want to answer to that because I think it's important in this context to address this issue. And well, I
I agree. I also think that the Green became very radical, and then in most parties, I mean, most countries, Green has become part of the establishment. And if you see particularly the evolution of the Green in Germany, I mean, in a sense, I mean, here I'm entering into very dangerous terrain, but I used to think, and I used to have some sympathy for the Austrian Greens, which I saw them usually as more radical. But I've been told that recently, when I speak to them, most of my friends say, well, not anymore, you know. I don't know what you think, but it's a pity, because I remember, in fact, the very first interview I had in Austria was by a Green journal, but that was a long time ago. It was in the 1990s or something like that, yes. And at that moment, I think the Green Party was very radical. But they are, or, I mean, according to the parties, the countries, they are relevant, or if they are even important, they become an interesting case. And this is my answer to your question. I think that, but because definitively, they are some of the demands of the Green, which have become, and maybe it's one of the reasons why the Green not tending, because many social democratic parties now have been trying to hijack, one can say. Everybody feels that they've got to say something about the question of global warming, environment. So the Green, what was specific of the demand of the Green now is being adopted. But, of course, it can be articulated in many different ways, because, you can have all those ecological issues can be articulated in a right-wing way or a left-wing way. And, of course, there is, we've seen that with the Green economy. The case of France is paradigmatic, because we are very near, I think, to a split in the Green Party. What I see the evolution is for the Green to move together with other groups.